students, and welcome to our first lecture for this class, First Language Acquisition. I've titled the lecture Seeking Insights because I think a lot of what people do when they study first language acquisition in second language acquisition course is try to see what can we learn from especially babies and children's experiences of learning their first language that we might be able to apply to second language acquisition or teaching. So since this is the first lecture of the course, I just wanted to make a quick note about the purpose of these lectures. So the purpose of these lectures is not because there will be a quiz or a test on the content of the lectures. The purpose is really to provide another way to learn and practice key concepts. I'm guessing that at least some or many of the concepts to you that you're reading about in this class are new. And as many vocabulary researchers have studied, and maybe also some marketing researchers, people need 7 exposures to a new vocabulary or a new concept before really integrating that concept. So by providing, the textbook chapters, practice activities, lectures, as well as the writing and other assignments for the course, I'm hoping to just provide that extra reinforcement. I'm also planning to highlight key ideas, as in the most important ideas, and in some cases include updates or my own ideas if they're necessary, as second language acquisition is a constantly changing and evolving field. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's start by watching this Patricia Kuhl video, The Linguistic Genius of Babies, which is a well-known TED Talk, and I would encourage you to watch the whole thing. It is.
So this is little Emma. She's a 6-monther, and she's listening to various languages in the earphones that are in her ears. You can see she can move around. We're tracking her head with little pellets in a cap, so she's free to move, completely unconstrained. It's a technical tour de force. What are we seeing? We're seeing the baby brain as the baby hears a word in her language. The auditory areas light up, and then subsequently areas surrounding it that we think are related to coherence, getting the brain coordinated with its different areas, and causality, one brain area causing another to activate. We are embarking on a grand and golden age of knowledge about the child's brain development. We're going to be
I think what this video, which as I said is from 15 or more years ago, shows why people are really seeking insight into first language acquisition. People always sort of imagine, not only the beauty of the child, but the beauty of what's happening inside their head as they learn a language. How it has seemed magical almost, like hard to understand. But now we're gaining so much more knowledge, and this continues to happen. So I'm going to put a link to Patricia Kuhl's research. If you're interested in this topic, you can read some of her more recent research where she studies other elements of the brain development in terms of infant language acquisition and interaction between parents and infants. So one really important point that we're learning about is that language acquisition is sometimes seen as pre-wired or natural or built-in for babies, especially for babies, as we can see it. So, and one thing that Patricia Kuhl's research shows was that babies were very able to perceive contrasts. That was why they were called citizens of the world, because they were able to perceive language contrasts in different languages. So if we have a sound in one language that's like t, another one that's like th, okay, they could hear those differences according to the scans that they did in any language until about 1 year, between 10 months and 1 year of age. It begins to shift. And maybe that's due to cognitive bandwidth. How much do babies actually have a capacity to remember? But we did notice that at the beginning of language acquisition, babies really have the ability to learn almost any language. Some other evidence that language acquisition is a pre-wired or natural process comes from the sort of staged development that all babies and infants follow across language groups in acquiring their first language. So moving from babbling and different forms of babbling to telegraphic speech, two-word utterances, usually with a lot of function words. Okay. Another important piece of evidence is that babies and children in their first language development, tend to follow an order of acquisition that follows these fixed steps in English, for example, but something similar happens in other languages as well. No matter that babies or children are hearing a lot of these elements, morphemes, these grammatical elements in their input and in what they're hearing around them, they pick these things up in this order, which is pretty incredible, right? Considering the diversity of children, the diversity of their language acquisition experiences, it's pretty amazing that they acquire it in very sort of patterned way that almost seems like nature. Another evidence for the natural elements of language acquisition is that most children tend to overgeneralize language. So they have some different examples like walked, okay, talked, eated, right? Adding the ed, overgeneralizing the ed as a past tense ending. Or another vocabulary example of overgeneralization would be calling every animal with 4 legs a dog, right? So these are, the fact that most babies and children undergo these different stages helps us see that maybe language acquisition has some of these natural or pre-wired elements. Now, one theory that doesn't really probably focus as much on that natural development is the theory of behaviorism as a reason that explains how children acquire languages. So as you may know from Skinner and classical conditioning, this is a theory that's used to explain many parts of human learning, right? That people receive a stimulus and provide a response. So if the baby says milk and receives their cup of milk, it provides sort of positive reinforcement, right? For them to continue saying milk, okay? So some people believed that language acquisition in children was built on this principle. That the child would say something, they would get a result, and it would reinforce them to continue to say things, okay? The criticism of this particular theory is that there are many novel utterances, and novel means unique, things that people have never said before, okay? So if the baby said if the baby asked for milk in a different way or said handle or something like that, there's no way to explain that because the novel utterances can't be explained by just the stimulus and response technique. Okay. Another common theory that was used to describe why or how child first language acquisition works is universal grammar. There's a little black box, a language acquisition device. So a language specific part of our brain that takes in input from the language and applies rules or parameters in some ways and processes it out. There were a lot of and this is something we're going to study more as we get into future chapters, but there were also several challenges to this technique, or this theory, I should say. One of them is emergentism, which suggests that language is not unique, but rather it emerges as other complex learning processes. So there's not one box just for language, but rather language is part of other complicated development processes. Okay, and this is linked, of course, also to connectionism, that language input creates neural connections. So as people hear the same things again and again, it builds more neural pathways and their language develops in that way. Okay. Finally, there's interactionism, which recognizes the importance of social connections in language learning. So there's the important concept of child-directed speech, which Cool's TED Talk is called Mother Ease. I think child-directed speech is probably a more appropriate term, right? Because parents are, not only mothers, are talking to children. So how do we adapt our speech to talk when we interact with children, and how does that affect their language acquisition? So when we know a little bit more about first language acquisition, it's natural to kind of want to compare it to second language acquisition. Now, in some ways, this is really comparing apples to oranges. If we are comparing two things, which are child first language acquisition and adult second language acquisition, it's hard to tell whether the comparison is based on adulthood versus childhood, okay, or first language versus second language. So we need to be really careful with the comparisons that we make, okay? But here are some of the comparisons that we have talked about that are relevant for first and second language acquisition. So some of the differences are, of course, that adults learning a language have greater cognitive skills, or metalinguistic awareness. Metalinguistics means knowledge of the higher parts of the language. For example, if we have a grammar chart that shows different pronouns and what verb forms they take, and we hand it to an adult, they could analyze it, right, and think about it, whereas a young child would not be able to do that. Okay? When people are learning a second language, they're often impacted by transfer from their first language. So transfer is like any rule from the first language that we apply to the second language, where interference is those things that we move over from the first language to the second that somehow impede understanding. Okay, some of these are focused on the difference between children and adults learning a language. So social expectations, of course, are different from for children and adults, as our learning context where people are learning. So many adults would be learning in school, in an academic context where children are learning a language naturalistically, perhaps. How much time people have to spend learning. This is something that my adult students always comment, that they're very busy, they're working, they have a lot of family responsibilities, but their children who move here with them, let's say, can really focus on language learning. How much adapted speech do people receive? Whether people are focusing on speaking and listening or reading and writing. And what's the final product? What's the expectation at the end of language acquisition? Of course, for first language acquisition, most people acquire their first language in a very high level, especially speaking and listening. But for second language acquisition, that's not always the case. Some of the similarities between different types of language acquisition: for both first and second language acquisition, people need input or exposure to the language, and people need a lot of repetition. In some ways, it might be easier to provide that repetition to children or to babies, because for adults, again, that cognitive piece comes in, where even if they need that repetition, the higher cognitive level might make it feel boring. Okay, in both first and second language acquisition, people need to learn formulaic sequences, chunks of language, and there's a consideration of performance versus competence. So performance means, well, let's talk about competence first. Competence is the underlying ability to use language, or the underlying understanding of language, but performance is what you're able to do with the language. So think of competence as the roots of a tree and performance as the branches of the tree. This doesn't mean the difference between listening and speaking or reading and writing, because sometimes, of course, with speaking, we're producing, and writing, we're producing, but even for listening or reading, we still have an underlying competence versus what we're able to do in those skill areas. Okay, and then finally, another similarity between first and second language acquisition is that both are acquired with some degree of systematicity, so that people follow a certain pattern of steps, which might suggest that both first and second language acquisition have some sort of natural processes that they are studying. So we will continue to explore these in our next lecture.